Hi, I'm Ed Stetzer. I'm the president of Lifeway Research. I'm so glad to be able to come and share with pastors and church leaders from across the world today. I love pastors and I love Leadership Network. So when Leadership Network asks me to come and talk to pastors, I say yes, even though they only give me 9 minutes. But we're going to talk some in these 9 minutes about maybe one big theme. And here's the theme. The theme is that mission is the opposite of self. And for you to be an effective pastor and leader, you have to consistently work to not make it about you, but to make it about God's glory and God's mission. And I mean you as well. I mean, our churches need to work to that. We need to help encourage our church. But we ourselves need to remember that mission is the opposite of self, and we have to consistently work to make it about God's glory and His mission and not about ourselves. Now, let me unpack that and kind of talk about that for a few minutes together. Let me say this first and foremost, is that the natural inclination of your heart and my heart is to make it about us. As much as we don't want to make it about us, it's the natural inclination of our hearts. One theologian put it this way: the heart is an idol factory. And so your heart and mine is consistently making idols. Now, as pastors, perhaps the idols are not the same. Now, we might say, well, in the world, is the idol of wealth, and maybe that's not something that as a pastor you struggle with, or maybe the idol is morality. Maybe that's not something you're struggling with, that we can be tempted in those ways as well. But because the heart is an idol factory, it can still create idols for us as pastors and leaders. And so those idols can be things like prestige, like professionalism, like to be treated appropriately. It's like the expectations we have because we see ourselves as religious professionals providing a service. And what I want to say to you is I think that requires us to have a rethink about pastoral ministry. It's a calling, it's a gifting, it's to an office described in the New Testament, but at the same time, it's not a profession, it's not a right. Instead, it's a calling, and part of that we have to model to our churches is to say we don't believe it's about us. And we know the opposite of mission is self, and we're going to join God on His mission and not make it about ourselves. We're going to resist the pull that there is, this idol factory in our heart. Instead, we're going to consistently say, how do we lay down before God? How do we say to the Father, change us and shape us so we might live on mission and then lead the people that God has given us on mission as well? So I want to talk today about how we might do that in 3 ways, how we might look, and we'll briefly touch on 3 scriptures to help unpack that. The first thing I want us to see is that those on mission, that pastors on mission, focus on God's glory and His agenda. Pastors on mission focus on God's glory and His agenda. Now, I hope that is reflective of you. I hope that what you talk about is frequently God's glory and God's agenda. Now, there are a lot of other things that we can talk about, and I get that, and there are a lot of things that you have to consider in the life of of leading your church. But what I would say to you is, if in the midst of that, if you're busy talking about we've got this program we've got to do, and this building we've got to talk about, and the idea we've got to implement, and we spend all our time saying we've got to be this incredibly creative person, that we're so busy in the work of the Lord that we do not focus on the Lord of the work, we have lost the proper focus. And what we are becoming is religious professionals who can put on an impressive show, but not people who have encountered God, been changed by our relationship with Him, and therefore minister and lead out of the overflow. And if that's not something you struggle with now, it's something you will struggle with along the journey. It is the normal order of things. You say, well, Ed, I don't pastor a church that has, 10,000 people. I don't have to worry about all those things. Listen, I've planted a church in the inner city of Buffalo, New York that had 4 people, and I worried about things that I didn't need to worry about. And I've preached, to churches of thousands, and I've worried about things I didn't need to worry about. What happens is that we worry about things about us rather than God's glory and His agenda. I think that this one way to think of this is to think of we need an encounter with God that changes us and shapes us. I think of Isaiah chapter 6, when Isaiah has this encounter with God and His holiness, and he's kind of caught up into this experience in Isaiah 6. In the year King Uzziah died, Isaiah says, I saw the Lord. And it's this temple and smoke and shaking and angels and all this stuff going on. And Isaiah, in encountering God in His holiness, responds as you and I would. He says, woe to me, for I'm a man of unclean lips, from a people of unclean lips. And he pronounces a curse on himself. And as we lead our people, we need to encounter God, and in doing so, live confession-filled, gospel-centered, cross-forgiven lives. And so we then say, woe to me, And then in the midst of that, Isaiah confesses that, and there's a moment of symbolic cleansing where the angel takes this coal and burns to his lips, and all this miraculous thing, these things take place. But to me, the most remarkable thing of all is upon that symbolic cleansing, what takes place next. In Isaiah 6:8, it says this, it says, "Then I heard the voice of the Lord saying, 'Who should I send? Who will go for us?' I said," this is Isaiah, "Here I am, Lord, send me." We need to encounter God so that we can lead people to be on mission for God so that they too might encounter him and then be on mission for him. Now don't miss this, because God says, "Who should I send? Who will go for us?" Isaiah says, "Here I am, Lord, send me." But I want you to notice there's an encounter with God that leads us to be on mission with God. I want you to hear this. There's a lot of talk about being missional today, and I think that's great. I'm a proponent. I've written on the subject. I think that's essential. But leading the church to be missional that has not encountered God and being transformed by God is a fool's errand that ultimately will lead to a dead end of spiritual transformation. We need to be people who are changed by the power of God, living through the direction and the anointing of the Spirit of God, so that we might then be on mission for God. It's God's mission. He gives us the strength and the power to do it, but he reminds us that it is not in our strength that it is done. So all the talk about missional is wonderful, but do not lead your church to be missional until you yourself and I have encountered and am in relationship with God, can lead them in that relationship, and can minister out of overflow. Second thing I want you to see is that those on mission reflect being with God. Those on mission reflect being with God. You'll remember in the Old Testament, Moses came down from the presence of God. His face was illumined with God's glory, but it frightened the people, so he covered it with a veil. Well, Paul then references that later on. I think it's a great reference for you and me as pastors and leaders. Paul teaches what happens when someone comes to Christ, and he says, whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Now the Lord is Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. But listen to what he says. We all, with unveiled faces, are reflecting the glory of the Lord and are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory. This is from the Lord who is Spirit. Pastors, let me just say to you, church leaders, let me just say to you that you and I need to reflect the glory of God because we have been in God's presence. Now, that begins, Paul's talking here about a relationship with God that begins with forgiveness and regeneration and the transformation of becoming a believer. But I'm convinced that people need to say of us, they've been with Jesus. And you can be the best leader and the best speaker, but if you haven't been with Jesus, you're leading from your own strength, not from the strength that the gospel provides. The last thing, and thirdly I want us to see, is that those on mission no longer live for themselves. We talk about, the glory of God and the agenda of God. We talk about reflecting being in God's presence, but it comes back to this, that those on mission should no longer live for themselves. Where's that? 2 Corinthians 5:14 and 15 says this. For Christ's love compels us, since we have reached this conclusion, if one died for all, then all died. And he died for all, listen here, and he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for the one who died for them and was raised. I want to say to you, I want to urge you to make it about Jesus, to say I'm no longer living for myself, the benefits, the opportunities that I have being a pastor and leader, but instead that I live for the one who died for me and was raised. I no longer live for myself. It doesn't mean I need to think less of myself. Listen, it's not about thinking less of you. It's about thinking of you less. Instead, thinking about God's glory, God's agenda, God's mission. Mission is the opposite of self. If you want to yourself be on mission and lead your church to be on mission, we have to preach the gospel to ourselves and preach the gospel to our churches to remind them that the cross-centered life reminds us we live for God's purposes. A gospel-centered life sends us out to work for and to proclaim God's salvation. An others-focused life keeps us focused on God's mission, but a spirit-directed and empowered life is necessary. May they say of you that pastor, that leader's been with Jesus, and they could tell.